I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. I see this word thrown around all the time today, and that is good. I just see it thrown around constantly. She's a good person. He's a good guy. That's a good life. But rarely do we ever define it. And when a culture stops defining goodness, it starts redefining it. Today's good, I think, often means non judgmental, agreeable, tolerant, socially acceptable. But biblical goodness is something that's far heavier because goodness is moral substance. See, when Galatians lists goodness as a fruit of the Spirit, it's not talking about niceness, okay? It's talking about moral integrity. This consistency between belief and behavior, your conviction and action, faith and obedience because of that faith. Goodness, ultimately, it's not image, okay? It is substance. It's not vague positivity either because some men just think that being good means you're not hurting anyone. But scripture goes further than that in Micah 6:8 when it says, "He has told you, O man, what is good, to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God." Notice something there, okay? Goodness involves action. It involves justice, kindness, humility. It is active alignment with God's character. And we see this all the time, mainly in, decisions on our own, because there's a moment that every man faces where you can cut a corner and nobody would know. No one would see it, and it could potentially save you some time and money and maybe avoid conflict in the process. But goodness is what you choose to do in that moment. Integrity is always proven in private. And this is why moral relativism, we see this all the time today, is the enemy of goodness, because we live in a time where good is subjective. What's good for you, what feels right to you, what aligns with your truth, right? But if goodness is defined by your own personal preference, then it loses weight. Because biblical goodness is anchored in God's nature, not in trends, not in culture, okay, not even in personal convenience. Because if God is holy, then goodness must reflect that holiness. And that also means that goodness is costly. Because if being good costs you nothing, then you're probably not practicing it all that deeply now, are you? So here are some things that goodness may cost you. It could be social approval with your friends, maybe even your family. It could be a job promotion. And what it's likely going to cost you is comfort and convenience. And this one may sting a little, but it might cost you certain relationships, because standing for what is right rarely makes you popular in a drifting culture. And let's just go ahead and imagine this for a second, all right? Let's go ahead and imagine you're getting that job opportunity, but it requires compromise. Nothing that's like illegal, nothing obvious, right? Just a subtle moral bending. Goodness sometimes means walking away. And walking away from an opportunity, it feels like loss, right? But integrity preserved is strength that is gained, okay? Many men these days, they claim belief, right? They attend church, they know scripture, they affirm the doctrine of the Bible, but when real decisions arise, they retreat. See, goodness, it requires embodiment. James himself, he writes, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only." Goodness moves from agreement to action. And that's why it takes courage. And that's why goodness and courage are so connected, because goodness without courage, it collapses. Because moral conviction will eventually face pressure. You're going to see this with peer pressure, cultural pressure, potentially even financial and relational pressure. And a man without courage, he becomes morally flexible. And a good man, he stays aligned even when it isolates him. Let's look at this with Jesus, okay? Jesus and goodness, because Jesus, he did not bend to public opinion, and he didn't soften truth to avoid backlash. He didn't even compromise holiness to gain approval. That being said, he wasn't self-righteous either. Okay, his goodness was steady. It was grounded. It was aligned with the Father's will above all else. That is the model that we need to follow. And what does this look like with leadership? What does goodness look like in leadership? Because if you lead without goodness, you will eventually corrupt what you build. Charisma without goodness, well, that's just manipulation, right? Confidence without goodness, that's just a form of domination. And ambition without goodness, well, that's just gonna destroy. See, goodness is what makes authority trustworthy because it means you don't exploit, you don't deceive, you don't betray, even when you could. And that's why goodness feels rare today, because goodness requires internal discipline. It requires resisting shortcuts, refusing corruption, and rejecting double lives. And many men want outcomes without moral refinement. They want influence without having to have good character. But fruit without root, it rots. So, there's something that's powerful about the man whose name carries weight. Not because he's loud, but because he's consistent. If he says he'll show up, he does. If he commits, he follows through. And if he speaks up, people trust him. That's what goodness looks like embodies. And it takes years to build and seconds to destroy, as we all know. Goodness, it ultimately protects your future, because a man who compromises repeatedly slowly erodes his own foundation. Sure, he may gain short-term advantage, but long-term, the cracks widen. Goodness, it builds stability because it protects your reputation, it protects your family and your legacy, your influence. And here's another thing, you cannot fake it indefinitely, because eventually fruit reveals the root. Goodness, it's not self-righteousness, okay? Because that's another trap, thinking that goodness makes you superior to others. It doesn't. It makes you responsible, because goodness, it should produce in you humility, because you recognize that it's the Spirit forming you, not from your own perfection, right? So I want you to go ahead and ask yourself for a second, if my private life were made public, would it align with what I claim to believe? That question alone reveals the state of your own goodness. The integrity, it means you don't need two versions of yourself. Goodness is moral consistency under pressure. It is obedience when compromise is easier. It is integrity when shortcuts are tempting. And it's courage without arrogance. Do not settle for appearing good. Become good. Align your private life with your public claims, because in a culture that redefines morality daily, men of true goodness will stand out and stand firm.